You want to find the Old Testament book of Ruth because our Advent series of messages is an Advent drama taken out of the wonderful little Old Testament book of Ruth and chapter 2. If you're not wise, Christmas can be a time of poor choices. We've probably all done this a little. For all we do to wrap the holidays in warm sentiment and festoon it with tinsel and garland, tensions and pressures often boil over at Christmas time. Have you noticed that? Unreasonable expectations are aroused in children and adults alike. Financial pressures can increase, and unhealthy behaviors often make unwelcome visits during Christmas. Family dysfunctions flare up, odd relatives show up, tempers blow up, we eat junk food and the kids throw up. Sometimes down your back, over the seat of the car. Within a few miles of the big gathering at Granny's house, don't ask me how I know that. And then you add drunkenness and gluttony as well. And because of these things, it's often hard to be merry at Christmas, or it's impossible to have a happy new year. I broke a chair at my sister-in-law's house one year during a rousing game of Pictionary at Christmas time. It was the same year that I broke the plumbing too. Again, don't ask me how. The next year, to be funny, I showed up with a big pipe wrench. Kind of still irks me that nobody found my clever gesture funny. To me, I don't think it's funny when I'm trying to be funny and my people don't think I'm funny. You might want to keep that in mind. Just drains all the holiday warm and fuzzy right out of you. Times like that, it's easy to make bad choices. That's what I'm saying. Christmas can be a bad choice time. Pressures can be a bad choice time. Life can be a bad choice time. Poverty can be a time of poor choices. First church I pastored after we were married, it was a little small church out west of town in Ohio, and it was a little modest parsonage and had a little modest salary. Nice people, they were good to us. They allowed me to have an additional job to get by, and we were young and things were tight. And sometimes things were very thin. It was kind of like paycheck to paycheck. And I remember once when things were so thin that we had gas, but we didn't have much food. And I called my sister and her husband, who's a pastor down the road about 30 minutes away. And I asked them if they wanted to get together, and they said they had food, but they didn't have gas. I'm like, well, that works out fine. We'll take our gas and come down there, and you can give us your food. Literally happened. So we had macaroni and cheese and grilled cheese sandwiches because the food they had was government cheese that was given to them. Now, you know you're poor, right? When you're eating grilled cheese sandwiches and macaroni and cheese with your family. So you can tell by looking at me, I've had a few meals since then. Somebody in their church had given them that. We made the most of it, but I can tell you this, that being poor and hungry gets old. And it gets old really fast, especially at Christmas time. Times like that, when you're poor and hungry or hurt, it's easy to make bad choices. And you know where I'm going with this, right? Ruth and Naomi had a choice to make. We talked about it last week. When we closed the last act of our drama, Ruth and Naomi were poor and they were hungry. It's hard to be poor and hungry. And when you're poor or hungry or lonely or vulnerable or oppressed or sad or depressed or abused or mistreated, powerless and hurt, it's easy to complicate your life by adding bad choices. And it's easy to make bad choices. Can I get a groan from the people? Yeah, it's easy. Bad choices are easy. Often comes like following God's way is kind of the hard way sometimes. There's always another way that's easier, a way that appeals to our desire for pleasure or ease or other desires that would involve sin. And our first unfiltered reactions are often sinful and foolish, and they make things worse. And that's true with Ruth. She could have turned back to Moab. This story would not be fun to read if she had done that. That's true of Naomi. We get a little glimpse of Naomi's wrestling with despair. And she could have given in to despair, and she could have turned her back on God. In the first act of the Advent drama of Ruth, there's a famine and 3 sad, hungry, desperate widows weeping on the road from Moab to Bethlehem. and one turns back. But Ruth joins Naomi in her bitter hardship and returns to Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest. What would befall these vulnerable widows and this woman from the despised Moabites? How would this work out? They were hungry, and they had left, or Naomi and her family had left during a famine. But in a little ray of foreshadowing of hope, they've returned during a harvest. And now, in chapter 2, a very interesting character walks onto the stage, and he's a farmer of all things. He's a prosperous, worthy farmer. Now, here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to tell the story that's in chapter 2, and then I'm going to point out 4 things to do and 3 things that happen when you do them, so you know how long you're going to be here. I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to point out briefly 4 things to do, implications from the story, and 3 things that happen when you do them. The structure of my sermon today is what we call narration, implication. It's the story, and what does the story mean to us? That's kind of what we're doing today. So the drama of Ruth, Act 2, it's chapter 2. In verse 1, Boaz is introduced, the farmer. Let's just read and talk our way through the story. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech. That was Naomi's husband that died. And his name was Boaz. So we're introduced to Boaz, this worthy farmer. Now in verse 2, Ruth takes initiative to glean, and Naomi agrees with her. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And Naomi said, she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth takes initiative to go out, and she does what, she's kind of like standing in the cheese line. She does what the law allows poor people to do. She goes into the field to get some leftover stuff that falls behind the gleaners. And she's just going out to find somebody that will be good to her. She's single, widowed single again, if you will. She's poor. She's maybe a new convert-ish. She is a minority. She is a woman. And there are all kinds of hints in this chapter that it is very dangerous to be a woman in her situation. She is vulnerable. And then chapter 3, Ruth happens humanly into the field of Boaz. Humanly it happened, but in God's view it's providentially arranged. We'll get into that in a minute. Look at it in verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in a field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. That was fortunate. It's kind of the way the narrative is going. Boaz comes out to greet his workers, and clearly he is a follower of Yahweh. It's delightful. Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Okay, I don't want to descend into the ephemeral, but I turned the TV off last night after the big game when Michigan won the Big Ten championship. Congratulations, Michigan people. And what I didn't hear was dutifully reported to me by the chairman of our elders who watches such things, or was it, no, that it was David, it was you, who said that the coach got on afterward and he gave honor to the Lord Jesus Christ. You're supposed to say amen right there. Amen. And that's like, it's a little bit like Boaz. You like that, Lois? A Michigan fan over here who's like, yes. Went to bed at halftime. I'm watching the game and I called her. I said, "Did you just go to bed?" She said, "Yes." I said, "You are not a Michigan fan." And first thing she said when she woke up, "Did they win?" I'm like, "Not telling you. Not telling." Anyway, that's kind of what Boaz does. Boaz is clearly a believer in God, in Yahweh. This is the story is saying, the first one's about, "The Lord be with you." And the answer, the Lord bless you. Labor relations. Amen. That's interesting. That's good. So you get a little foreshadowing of who Boaz is. Then in verse 5, notice he asked about Ruth the Moabitess. Boaz said to his young man, his foreman, if you will, who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? Who's the new girl? Who's the new lady? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. This implies her story's kind of out. You know, you heard about her. So the worker says, she asked if she could glean. Verse 7, she said, please let me glean and gather sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. The foreman gives a report on her labor. And he says she hadn't stopped working since she got here, except for a little short lunchtime. This is the kind of person you want to hire. She showed up, passed the drug test, did the work, took a little short break, but she's from Moab. Go figure. This is kind of the way it goes. So now, during this exchange, Ruth must have been in earshot, present. I'm assuming she's looking at the ground, and then Boaz turns and speaks to her for the first time in the story. Boaz says to Ruth, by the way, when you track this narrative, one of the things to do would be to take a highlighter and give a color to each speaker in the play. So you know who's talking, and meaning kind of pops out when you do that. Boaz is speaking. Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one. Keep close to my young women. You stay around here, and don't you glean in another field, and you stay close to my young women, he says in verse 8. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them, the young women. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? It's an implication of danger there. And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Don't draw your own water. We're going to see to it that you get what you need. This is incredible that this worthy, wealthy, highly esteemed landowner guy is speaking to Ruth the Moabitess, and he's speaking with kindness to her. And he's promising protection, and he's giving her direction, and he's promising her that she doesn't have to get thirsty out in the hot sun in the spring of the barley harvest. So he says, stay here in this field. That's an important thing. Stay here in this field. She responds, verse 10, she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? Boaz answers in verse 11, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. And in my humble opinion, verse 12 is the sweet spot. Are you ready? If you want to understand the central truth of this, if you want to understand the heart of the narration, I think it's coming up. And the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward will be given to you by the Lord. Suddenly, Boaz introduces another character to the drama in the second act, and that character is God, Yahweh. He brings him up. She's like, oh, the narrator is like, it's fortunate she's in Boaz's field. And then later on, thank you for what you did. Why did you do it? Well, because of your character and because of your initiative, and because I heard a story about you. And may God bless you and reward you. May a full reward, verse 12, be given to you by the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel. Listen, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. I borrowed an old pickup truck one day from a lady to get gravel for her statues. She was paying me for it. It was a side hustle. I'm not really good at stuff like this. I haven't done it much. I drove the pickup truck to the gravel pit. And there's this big hopper overhead. They said if you pull the chain, gravel will come out and will fill up the truck. It was a very, very neat, satisfying thing to do. I pulled the truck under the chute, pulled the chain. Everything happened just like they told me. The truck began to fill up with gravel. I don't know how much gravel it would hold. I did it kind of by volume instead of weight. If you know what you're doing, like I didn't, you know that was a really bad idea. I way overfilled this truck. You should have seen the guys on the scales when I came up. They looked at each other kind of like humorously like, and I said, did I put too much in? They go, it's pretty heavy. In polite understatement, it's pretty heavy. I'm like, do you have like an apparatus to take some off? They go, yeah. I remember this last night. They go, a guy there kind of goes, over there. And I look over there, and there's like a big grain shovel over there. I'm like, you got to shovel it off? And there's more to that story, but it has nothing to do with my message. Here's what has it. Buy me coffee, I'll tell you the rest. But here's what has to do with the message. Sometimes I think about parking the truck under that chute, pulling that thing and all that stuff coming down. You want to be in that place with God where you just park under the chute of his blessing and then pull, and then he just fills your life with blessing. You want to be in a place where God says, you get in this place, I will protect you. You get in this place, I will provide for you. You stay in this place, I will give you all the guidance you need. That's the place where you want to be. Put yourself in the place of blessing is the name of this message. Put yourself under the chute of God's blessing. This is what Boaz says to Ruth. You have sought refuge from Yahweh, from God, and he will reward you. This is the message of the whole book. And it comes up here. And then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. And the plot gets even thicker. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. Eat with me. And dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Honey, I think what she did was she was eating, and then she sat back and she sighed. She went, that's how I can tell I get to eat the rest of Lois's food. We go to a restaurant, she eats, and then at one point she goes, and I'm like, were you going to eat that? And that's why I'm twice as big as her. Here was Ruth, and the narrator is careful to remind us that she was satisfied. I wonder how long it had been since Ruth had been satisfied, since she had all she wanted to eat. Now, she's satisfied, and she has some left over. Why do you suppose? Did she take it to eat it later? We're going to see. And she rose to glean. Boaz instructed his young men, this is even getting better, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves and do not reproach her. And also pull some out from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean and don't rebuke her. Can you see this? She starts back to work and he goes, guys, come here. Here's what I want you to do. You see to it she gets what you don't, and you be good to her. And if you want to drop a little extra, just go ahead and drop a little extra. So verse 17, she gleaned in the field until evening. And then she beat out what she had gleaned. Now this is important because they had the harvest and the stalks, and then they had to get the grain off it. So it was pretty labor intensive. She worked hard. The narrator is careful to say she didn't just take the stalks home, but she actually followed through on the reaping process, and she got the grain, and it was a large amount. Now, she beat out what she had gleaned. It was about an ephah of barley. Now, my wife makes candles. She makes them out of wax, and the wax comes in 50-pound boxes. I wish it came in littler boxes. It comes in 50, which I know some of you men are sitting there going, 50 pounds, I can do that with my left hand and my eyes closed. But 50 pounds for a guy my age and in my particular line of work is kind of heavy. To carry in multiple boxes from the car to the house it's a little job to get the 50-pound boxes. This is 30 to 50 pounds that she's carrying home. This is people that would have known these measurements would have immediately recognized, wow, not only did she work hard, but this is a smiling providence. She has really got a lot of grain here. And we know this because where does she go? Well, you know how you do. You go directly to the people you know love you, and you give a report on what happened. And she took it up and went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she also brought it out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. I think Ruth probably watched Naomi eat. And Naomi was happy, satisfied. Her mother-in-law said, "Where did you glean today?" Is this wrong to say? Are girls better at this than boys? Girls ask all the details of a story. I mean, the girls in my life are often that way. They're like, "And then what happened? And what do you think they meant by that? And what happened after?" I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. It just happened. I didn't really pay attention. What did she say? What did he say? What do you think they meant by that? I'll tell you what I think they meant. I'm projecting this on Naomi. I think she's doing this, and she's not petty. She's smart. She's savvy. She's been around. Her mother-in-law saw what she gleaned. She brought out and gave her the food she had left over. Verse 19, her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. You have benefited here." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked as she said, and the narrator leaves this for effect, obviously. "And the man's name with whom I worked today was Boaz." It's Boaz. And Naomi's eyes light up. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi is always conscious that she's the victim of losing her husband and her sons, and continually says, God has blessed, and Boaz has been good to the living and the dead. May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. And Naomi said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." In the law of the time, he would have been one who would have some responsibility to care for them. But would he do it? In verse 21, Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished my harvest." Now, I don't know why she said that, but that's not what he said. He said, keep close to the young men. Is that what he told her? It's not what he said. He said, keep close to the young women. It's just interesting. There's no commentary on this. We don't really know why this detail is here, but it is interesting that Boaz says, you keep close to my young women, and you get drink when the young men get drink. And then she says, I decided I'd keep close to he said, keep close to the young men. It's really kind of interesting because then Naomi says to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women." If you allow me to use my sanctified imagination, I think Naomi kind of knows what's up. And Boaz knows what's up. And maybe in a couple ways, Naomi knows what's up. Number one, she knows Ruth's vulnerability. She knows the danger that a young woman would have. And she corrects young men to young women. Stick with the young women. My own personal theory, but I'm a romantic, is Naomi might have something else in her mind too, but maybe my imagination is running away with itself. Then she says, "Lest in another field you be assaulted." So she's concerned for her safety. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest. This is probably a 3-month period of time. Gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. That's the end of Act 2. Some say Samuel wrote the Ruth story. Whoever it was trying to encourage followers of God to put their trust in him during a dark, discouraging, dangerous time. And when many around were not living in faithfulness to God, during this time, God the Holy Spirit inspired this story to encourage people to see the Lord rewards those who trust him, who want to be in covenant with him. Now, the 4 things I promised. Choose to take refuge in God. Number 1, hope in God. I'm suggesting, obviously, you do what Ruth did. Hope in God. Trust in God. Trust in his providential care. Trust that when things are happening, God is in control of the things that are happening, and he's working out a beautiful story of redemption and of loving kindness. Hope in God. Number 2, obey him. This is what Ruth did. She said, I'm going to trust him, and I'm going to obey him. She took initiative, and she worked hard. While you're waiting for God to do whatever he's going to do, take initiative and work hard. Have some character. This is what happened here. She acted in faith and obedience. I'm certain that when we do this, God will prompt us. God will empower us as believers. He said that. Maybe you find yourself weeping on a dark road, or troubled, or tempted to make a bad choice. It's good to take a page out of Ruth's book here and hope in God and trust in him and obey him. And third, humble yourself and take direction from older, wiser people. This is what Ruth obviously did 2 or 3 times in this particular drama. And then I would say, and this is important, stay in the right field. Follow the right people. Stay out of the wrong field. God says, park your truck right under this spout and watch what I do. You won't be able to carry it away. God is able. Stay in the right field. Stay out of the wrong field. In other words, don't do what you think is right. Do what God says is right. Don't follow your human initiative or intuition. But follow what God says, even if it crosses the grain of your intuition. Put yourself in the path of blessing. When you find yourself weeping on the road, take refuge in God. Whatever you're thinking about right now, keep trusting God. If it's going to get so fewer and fewer people who live around you are going to be trusters in those who trust in God. And you're going to be in a growing or a shrinking minority. Understand this, though. When you do these things, I told you the 4 things that kind of like, how would you trust in God? Well, you would trust in God, and you would hope in God, and you would obey God, and you would humble yourself and live in humility and take direction from God. Don't be self-willed. Ruth was not self-willed here. And then stay in the place where God says to go. Stay away from the place God says not to go. Then what happens? This is what happened with Ruth. God can arrange people along the way. This is beautiful and blessed. Boaz was a man who blessed people. He was a man who showed loving kindness. And beautifully, he pointed them to God. This is a good model. If you were a young man and you decided to follow Boaz's example, it would be good. If you said, you know what, in my life as a young man, I'm going to look for people I'm going to be a blessing. He shows up in the field and he says, may God bless you. And they're like, God bless you too. And then he backed it up with action. He gave away stuff. He was generous. He had compassion. There's a picture of the compassion that God has, the loving kindness that God has. And then as a young man or a young woman, or even if you were an old man, this would be a good idea. Point people to God. In this story, it's like, and then this happened, and then that happened, and Boaz says, no. It's almost as if Ruth says, she falls down and says, thank you. And Boaz says, it wasn't me, it was God. He blessed people. He showed loving kindness. He pointed people to God. Ed Hill was speaking to our men yesterday morning at breakfast. I understand we had a great ladies' event, well attended, a good men's breakfast, a hearty men's breakfast, my goodness. And Ed was talking about this. He was saying to the men, we want to be men who follow Jesus and help other men follow Jesus. He said that 4 or 5 times. Every time he said it, made me happy. But yes, that's right. Men and women, young men, like with the spirit of Ruth, with the spirit of Boaz, okay, spirit of Naomi. Hey, you're wrestling with things that are happening to you, but you're landing on your feet and you're trusting God. And you're making him known and you're doing good and you're being a blessing. God can arrange people along the way like that. This is beautiful. Think about this. You're stumbling along this dark road and you're weeping, and then God can keep going this because I want you to meet somebody, but you got to keep going. And then there is the person that she has favor with, and God uses that person to pour out blessing on her. You keep going and you keep obeying God, and God will, I know this from personal experience, God will line people up along the road just at the right time to bless you. It's agents of his blessing. Number one, God can arrange people along the way. That's pretty sweet. Number two, God can abundantly provide and faithfully protect. You saw this in the story of Ruth. You saw that she came back. Literally, it would have been physically difficult for her to get all that grain home. It was a little knapsack. And then, when I was a boy, I read books by Zane Grey. In junior high, I discovered Zane Grey novels. I loved them. They were full of adventure. They were full of danger. They were full of courageous men. But one of the things that kept me turning pages late into the night was because along with the adventure and along with the drama and along with the danger, guess what else was in every Zane Grey story? Romance. In every story. I'm surprised you didn't know. I'm a little disappointed you didn't know that. Romance kept me turning the pages. If you had ever read this story, if you had never read this story before, wouldn't you still have a hunch there's more to the story than Ruth and Naomi getting enough to eat here? Wouldn't you have a sense there's something more? Wouldn't you turn the page looking for the romance? We'll turn the page next week. But this I can tell you, when a woman or a man or a young woman or an old person puts their hope in God and takes refuge in God, God will reward them in creative ways. This is the third thing. God is a good writer, and he'll keep adding chapters to your story until it ends well. There might be hard chapters in the middle. Matter of fact, there will be hard chapters in the middle. But God's a good writer, and you want to back your truck up under the chute of his blessing. If you're weeping on the road of loss, tempted not to trust God, hungry or vulnerable or hurt or bitter, here are examples to follow. Follow the example of Ruth. Follow the example of Boaz. Follow the example of Naomi. Follow the example of Yahweh. This is what it says to do. Romans 15:4 says, whatever was written before, this would include Ruth, was written for your instruction, that through endurance and through encouragement of scriptures you might have hope. A wise person would take refuge in God again and again. They would pray, God, give me the initiative, the loyalty, the humility, the diligence of Ruth. They would pray, God, give me the spirit of Boaz to bless and do good and point people to God. And give me the faithful perseverance of Naomi to push through the bitterness and loss into abundance with God. It's interesting, we come to the end of this act, and what's happening? Ruth is working in the harvest of Boaz, and she's living with Naomi in a secure place, but there are foreshadowings that there's more to come, and we suspect it's romance. The women weeping on the road have an awakening hope, but the story hints of romance and of redemption. You sense there's a romance to come. And beyond that, if you know the Bible, you know there is this romance to come is a picture of a greater romance to come. And that romance is a Christmas story that will be told around the world. For God so loved the world that he sent his son, a Redeemer, in Bethlehem. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's a story for another day. Would you stand?